Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acre supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Britain. An ancient landscape where stories are written in the blood of a violent and tormented past. A topography of dense, forgotten woodlands, ruined towers, and weed-choked concrete wastelands. Are you sitting comfortably? Then join us as we open the pages of the General Witchfinders Book Club of weird and unsettling British fiction. Don't worry, they are just stories. They can't hurt you, can they?
Hi, I'm Ross, one of your hosts for this, the very first General Witchfinders Book Club. This is a new spin-off from my regular British horror podcast and is run in partnership with Teaser and Skylark, my local independent bookshop down here in Dorchester. To accompany a real-life, face-to-face book club every other month, I'm inviting along a special guest co-host onto the show to discuss the book we're reading. Here, on our inaugural episode, I'd like to welcome Ray Newman. Hi, Ray.
Hello, and thanks for having me. It's fantastic to be here.
No worries. Ray is an author and has published the novel The Gravedigger's Boy, as well as three of my favourite collections of short stories, Municipal Gothic, Intervals of Darkness, and Thin Places in Hard Concrete. We've been lucky enough to include some of his writing in each of our General Witchfinder zines, and after a long time corresponding virtually over the years, I'm very pleased to speak to him tonight. So I was thinking, Ray, that you're one of those people who I can't remember how and when I started talking to you on things like Blue Sky, or I don't know if you was on Twitter before, but you just seem to be one of those people who've always been there, but I've never actually seen face to face. I've heard your voice on other podcasts, but this is great to actually have you on.
Yeah, you've gone through the gradual surprise of hearing my voice first and being like, oh, didn't think he'd sound like that, and now we're actually looking at each other.
Yeah.
The listeners can't see what I look like, and that's fine.
It's stunning.
Yeah.
It's stunning.
Oh yeah.
Tonight, we are discussing Andrew Michael Hurley's 2019 book, Acre. So I say warning, there will be spoilers in this podcast. We're going to be assuming that you've read the book if you're listening to this. If you haven't, pop to your local independent bookshop and grab a copy, read it, and then come back. And I will probably get my wife to read this bit.
The worst thing possible has happened. Richard and Juliette Willoughby's son, Ewan, has died suddenly at the age of 5. Convinced that the boy still lives on in some form and desperate to make contact, Juliette seeks the help of the Beacons, a seemingly benevolent group of occultists, whereas Richard tries to blot out the pain of his grief by turning his attention to the field opposite their house, Acre. Patiently, he digs in the barren soil looking for the roots of a legendary oak tree, but unearths something which ought to have remained buried.
If we need to refer back to any of the characters, I've got them on the document there, because I don't know if you noticed that any of my podcasts, I just refer to the people by the actors' names because I can never remember anyone's characters' names. I think they should do more often, especially in whodunits, is have a list of characters at the beginning of the book so you can refer back to it.
Like you get in big Russian novels where they have to do it because all the characters are referred to by like a name, a diminutive name, and sort of a couple of other, like a royal name, so they list them all in the front and a table. Yeah, super helpful.
Yeah. I think one of the Kim Newman books, Anna Dracula, had a really good cover where it had all the names of the characters, and it said like the adventurer, the vampire, and the amount of times I find it like, especially because I often fall asleep reading. And first thing, if I don't make it to the end of the chapter, I'm like, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what any of these people are, what they want, what they're doing. So it's really good to have that back.
Yeah, definitely.
But I mentioned that to one of the guys in the bookshop the other day, and he said that he, especially on a whodunit, he has a notebook to write stuff down. I think that's a little tip.
Oof, that's very interactive and organised, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I always try, if I write something, just have one or two characters in it, and then I don't lose track. Have you read any of Hurley's other books up until this point?
I haven't, and I only read this one because you asked me to, and that's probably because two reasons. One, I'm really bad. If someone says you've got to read this book, it's fantastic, you can guarantee I will never ever read that book. Like, for some reason, I think in my head that just says I don't need to. Everyone else has read it, or I don't know. I'm just a bit contrary, so I often don't read books. People buy me books as presents, and I go, thanks so much, put it on the shelf, never read it. And the other is because I guess arrogantly, I think that I'm writing in a similar territory to this much more successful writer. I'm a bit nervous to read stuff by people that, like, when people read my stuff and they say, oh, this is a bit like something Andrew Michael Hurley wrote, I think, danger, I shouldn't read it, because it'll get in my head, basically. But so, no, I haven't read any of the others, and this is the first one I've engaged with at all.
Fantastic. Well, I've read two of the other ones. I've read one which I've been calling The Lonely forever. And then I said it, and we did a live podcast recently, and someone asked for a book a recommendation. I put a picture of the book up on the screen and was talking about The Lonely until someone was going, it says Lonnie? And I was like, yeah, so I completely got that wrong. And Devil's Day. And I thought they were both excellent. It's one of the things I'm trying not to spoil it, but I preferred them way more to Starve Acre.
Okay.
But I felt like one of them, I get the two of them mixed up. I thought the Lonnie was the better of the two. I really enjoyed that one. I don't want to spoil it. So sometimes when someone said, I'm not going to spoil this part of it, by them saying a bit, you work it out. But Devil's Day, I felt like was so similar to Starve Acre. There was a lot of about like people taking over like a family farm or a family. So I thought that was very similar to taking over the family home and stuff. A pregnancy, children, very similar themes. If I was going to recommend any of his books, I would recommend The Lonnie over Starve Acre.
Overnight, snow had fallen thickly again in Croftondale, and now in the morning the fells on the other side of the valley were pure white against the sky. Further down, where the sun had not yet reached, the wood by the beck was steeped in shadow and would stay cold all day. The freezing mist that was twined beneath the leafless beech and birch had already driven a hungry fox to seek food elsewhere. A line of deep paw prints came out of the gloom and into the pearly light that washed over the drifts on this side of the dale. Yet the animal seemed to have changed direction abruptly, startled into a hollow or a ditch by the folk out shooting nearby. Men from Micklebrow, probably, who'd walked over the moor to take advantage of the wide, empty canvas on which the grouse and pheasants were as bright as streaks of paint. The sound of shotguns and whistles doubled in air that was uncannily still, expectant after the blizzard. The storm had lasted for hours, and the extent of its fury was marked by icy cornices blown over the dry stone walls. They were wild, jagged crests, like those of a sea surge breaking on inadequate defences. So the winter went on, adding to itself day by day, making the houses in the dale seem even more remote from one another than usual. None of the farmers had been out yet with a plough, and on the road by Starve Acre the snow cleared the evening before had frozen solid. All along the verges it was piled like crumbled pieces of cumulus.
It starts off really trying to evoke the sense of place, the time of year.
Yeah, I think this is. I was immediately quite impressed by him as a writer because I'm very sensitive. I think because I've worked as an editor and things, I'm very sensitive to cliches and lazy writing, basically. Which is not to say I don't ever do that, but when I'm reading other people's stuff, and I think I was reading it, as you say, the sense of place, thinking, oh wow, this is someone that's got that kind of nature writer's sensibility. And I was thinking of people like Alan Garner, like that ability to evoke a place. Even though, so Starve Acre, he says he found on a map somewhere that like there are multiple places called Starve Acre, and he sort of, that's what was the inspiration for the title and partly for the story. But quite a lot of it, I found myself thinking, fake place names. Like it just feel like I sort of think I should have said it somewhere real, maybe. But no, it's clearly in his mind based on somewhere real and somewhere he knows, and that really helps it chime and feel real. And the time of year, the setting is so important, and you get the sense that this is someone that's really observed what trees do, what the landscape does at certain times of year. And I suppose it's also quite nostalgic now, isn't it? This feeling like we don't really get proper winter anymore, and summer's tropical these days, and so actually that proper 70s winter is quite evocative of something.
Well, the first time I read this, it didn't occur to me that it was set in the past. I don't know why. It's just obvious that there wasn't any mobile phones and stuff in there, but I think that just went over my head because I feel like often writers just remove them from stories anyway because it just makes it too convenient. But the second time I ran it through, I was like, oh, hang on, especially when they were describing like the contents of the kid's room and stuff, and I was like, this doesn't sound like a kid of now.
Well, it's hard to tell whether I would have known that because I saw the film whenever that came out a while ago, and that's so obviously set in the 70s because I think I've moaned about this on Blue Sky. They've all got terrible wigs and it's very like laid on quite thick, like Life on Mars or something. It's really laid on the period setting. So in my head, it was like set in the 70s, but there's nothing. It doesn't start with a date. There's nothing in the text that pins it down. But then I was looking around trying to work out, has he ever said it's set in the 70s or is it just that he, as you say, he's deliberately removed signs of modernity to make the story more interesting? And then I found had not realised this. It was published under a different author's name originally as by Jonathan Buckley in part of this series of books that Dead Ink did called the Eden Book Society, where they pretended they were books from the 1970s that had been rediscovered. I did not know any of this till about an hour ago, and I was like, oh, that explains a lot. And that book was explicitly described as being published in 1972. So it's not only is it set in the 70s, it's supposed to kind of be an artifact of the 70s.
I think I would have enjoyed it better if I knew that. I really love Dead Ink. I've discovered them recently, and I'm just buying. I've subscribed to them so that you get a book every month and stuff. And pretty much everything I've had from them so far, it's been great. And I saw at the end of the book when it said that Dead Ink was the ones who commissioned this story, which is great. It's one of those things where often I feel like if I've picked up a metaphor in something, I feel like it might be trailed on a bit too thick because I'm not someone who picks up that sort of stuff up. Winter's been picked because, like grief, it feels like it's going on forever, and it's you've had better days, you've had your summer's in the past, winter's here, and it feels like it's never going to end. It will end one day. Spring will come, and I felt like particularly in the first. I don't think it has chapters, is it? I was going to say first couple of chapters, but it hasn't got chapters. It's got part 1 and part 2. At the beginning of the story, I think the description of winter was excellent. And there are certain parts when things happen in the story, signs of winter ending start happening. And I thought it was done pretty well. I thought that worked really well. Yeah, and I'm despite having an English degree and all of that, I'm never very confident with this. But is this pathetic fallacy where the weather kind of reflects the mood of the characters, and I think you're absolutely right about the fact that winter and grief both have an end. So, like, you know, we've all probably lost people, and you have that time, that first year after they've gone, when you think about them all the time, and it feels very raw, and then gradually you catch yourself thinking, oh, I didn't actually think about them today, or like and maybe a couple of months after they've gone, you find yourself momentarily feeling a bit guilty that you felt happy, and I think. There is something about, very clearly the winter is supposed to reflect they're in an emotional winter. It seems quite sort of clear that that's what he's going for, I think. He's very good at setting stuff up, and I think a lot of stuff got put in the first sort of 10 pages. So we've got the location, we've got the conflict within their marriage, because we got Richard and Juliette are both dealing with the grief of their child differently and separately, which is always difficult. We've got the mystery of the death of the child, so we know the child has died. There was a really nice part in it where when we first hear mention of Ewan, if I can find it, there's going to be lots of me. I'm going to be like Russell Brand now, going through trying to find the bit I was thinking about. Richard goes out into the field because he said Ewan, the first time we hear of Ewan, he said Ewan never bothered him out here in the field. And at that point, it was like, okay, well, is it the memory of Ewan, or is it the ghost of Ewan, or am I saying his name properly? Ewan, yes. Yeah, although he's called Owen in the film, apparently, just to mess things up. Right, okay. So I purposely haven't watched the film yet because it was one of those. I'm a big Matt Smith fan. Well, like you were saying about sometimes when you see something, it can get into your head when you read something. In my mind, like I've put Matt Smith into this, but but I've been listening to the audiobook as well as reading it whilst I was been driving, and the voice the guy does is like, that's not Matt Smith. This is wrong. This is too gruff. They set up the mystery of the child. They mention the beacons as this mysterious, potentially supernatural group, and the fact that he's digging for something in this field which someone has said is haunted, and that's all in the first 10 pages. And I think it's. So, what do you think about that? Do you think that's an economy of because it's described as a novella? I never know what the official term of a novella versus novel is.
Yeah, I think it's a novel. It's I think of a novella as being like 70 pages, but this is definitely, I know it's, they've left a lot of white space, but it's still definitely longer than a George Simenon novel or something. I think, I do think it's economical. That's part of the thing. One of the things that kind of annoyingly impressed me about it as well is if you think in terms of songwriting, you talk about a song with hooks, like, oh, this is going to be a hit because it's got that brilliant chorus and that cool sound effect and that drum sound or whatever. And it's like in the first 10 pages, as you say, we just get multiple hooks. Like, I want to know about, they're almost like multiple different novels are teased. And then I think that carries on through the rest of the book. It's billed as a folk horror, and that's definitely how it's pitched. But I was like, this is also just a really good haunted house story. And as you say, a whole novel about grief and families and like multiple different things. And then it's kind of a serial killer, like the origin story of a serial killer. Like there's a lot in it. And for all it's got this whiff of kind of literary cred about it, it's not pretentious or overly wordy. It's very like smartly, neatly put together, I think.
Yeah. But I think one of the things, and I'll probably come to it later on, I feel like I'm trying and work out in my head, does it pay off all of that setup? Because I think a lot of stuff, like you said, a lot of those things would be on its own would be a good enough for a novel. And and I don't know if it just leaves me wanting a bit more with a lot of those elements.
There's one thing in particular that I was just trying to have a quick read through again now and go, did I just miss something? But all that stuff about the blood test,
yes,
which was so weird and unsettling, and I was like, what's going on here? And then they just say, the blood test, you passed the blood test. Oh, I faked it for you. I'm like, sorry, what did you do? What was
exactly.
The
so that's something because first time I read that through, I was like, okay, I've missed something here. Went back through again, and it's not there. So we should explain that the beacons are this almost like a spirit, almost like a spiritualist group. But it doesn't feel like they believe in ghosts quite so much, more of like a life spirit, and they sort of, it feels to me like they believe that light, the life within people, will stay with that person for a short period of time, and then it will move on and go somewhere else, potentially to another living thing. I think. And Richard is very skeptical of this group, thinking that they are probably going to take advantage of the situation they're in, and they are going to come to the house to have some kind of ceremony, seance type thing. But in order to say whether Richard can be part of this, he has to give some blood. And it's reading through, it's not 100%. They're not 100% clear that they're actually taking blood from him. You have to sort of read between the lines to work out what that is. And I feel like he does that quite a lot in this book. There's things which are implied, and you almost have to you have to sort of come to those conclusions yourself of what's actually happening. And then they say that, like you said, that they said the blood test has been passed, but then later on they say that it was faked. But why? And what impact has that got on the story at all? I've written "so what" in there.
Yeah. And I think often when you get writers like this, it's what you want to know is, does Andrew Michael Hurley have this all worked out and he's just not telling us everything? Or is he doing also a totally legitimate way to write weird stories or horror stories? He's just dropping in these weird little details, leaving them unresolved, and just saying it all adds to the mood and the weirdness, and it all adds to the feeling of being unsettled. Like I don't understand what's going on here, and it freaks me out. Is that, maybe that's fine? I don't know.
So if you were working with an editor, is that the sort of thing they would pick you up on and say, this isn't going anywhere?
I think so. Yeah.
So would you have to fight your corner to say, I want to leave this in? I'm always intrigued about how editors work.
Well, we had a chat about this once, I think, I can't remember. It was when you interviewed me for the zine, and about the fact that some of my stories sort of end on a bit of an unresolved note. And I would say every conversation I have with someone about my stories, where they're offering sort of editorial commentary, it's either the ending feels a bit unresolved, you need to explain what's happening, or I wish you'd finished it 2 lines earlier and left it a bit unresolved. Right. So that's like the key sticking point for a lot of people. And this is now a book club about me.
That's fine. That's why I've got you on.
I wrote a story a few years ago called Men Who Live in Caravans, and the version I submitted to Minor Literatures, the magazine that eventually published it, the editor said pretty much no notes, except I'm just going to remove the final line. And he did that. And the story immediately was like 70% better. I was like, oh God, it just suddenly feels like it finishes on this like unresolved, shivering note. Mm-hmm. Whereas the thing I'd done was almost a bit like when you're 9 and you write a story where someone wakes up and it was all a dream.
Did it say, and it was a dream?
And then he looked under the bed. Yeah. No, but it wasn't quite that bad, but it was just a little bit more sort of on the nose. And I think what you get in Starve Acre is quite a lot of that, leaving things a bit unresolved, letting you do a little bit of the running. And we're going to get to the ending, I'm sure. But that, when I've looked online, there's a 50-50 split of I loved the ending. It left me feeling like almost like, I don't, like sort of on the very, very sort of keyed up, and then it just yanked something away from me. Or a lot of other people going, what happened? Why didn't he just say what happened? Yeah. Needs another chapter.
Yeah. When people give you the explanation, it just spoils it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
All the Star Wars prequels for examples of just leave it to their imagination. So one of the other things which I felt that was in the book, and I couldn't understand why it was this whole storyline about Richard's dad's book collection that he was sorting through. They imply that his dad was an academic as well, had a huge collection of books. I think this is another thing which made me realise when I was paying a bit more attention that it wasn't set in the modern day, but when everything he was looking up, he had to go and find the book to look it up in. But it implies that his dad was driven mad by something, and then that made him completely mess up his cataloguing of his books. But I just didn't understand what that was, apart from a device for him to find elements of these prints of like this thing that happened in the field in the past.
Yeah, I think you're probably onto something there, is that it's partly another weird detail that's like, oh, weird. This isn't the first time this house the house is a bit sick. This isn't the first time on the field. This isn't the first time it's driven someone mad or created this kind of crack in reality for someone. But also it meant that he could gradually find those woodcuts over the course of a long period of time. Whereas if his dad's library had been properly organised, there'd have been a box file called Weird Woodcuts About Fields, and he could have just with some notes or whatever. So I think it's possibly a plot, a way of managing the story a bit better, partly just a weird, freaky detail. And also, it's another thing that in another writer's hands would have been really cliched, that the spooky old library with the tomes that reveal the story. It's like Lovecraft or something, but it isn't in this, but it is.
Potentially, maybe it gives him another thing to take him away from his wife to be doing, because there is a whole thing about him just trying to keep busy to stop him coming to terms with the fact that his son has died. It says, I just got to have other things to do. So he's cataloguing these books. He's digging around in the field to try and find the roots of this ancient tree, which used to be in the field, which was like legendarily massive, but there's no evidence of it there anymore, which is another great hook for a story.
It's not that unusual, I can tell you. Gordon poured the tea. At what stage you decide that the whole thing's Oshios and call it a day? He said. Or are you going to take up the entire field? Don't you think the roots are there? Asked Richard. I think there's something there, said Gordon. Yes, you may well smile, but I've lived here longer than you and I've seen things. Seen things? In the mind's eye, yes. Well, like what? Gordon considered the question. Things left over, he said. How do you mean? It was hard to put my finger on it exactly, but you certainly couldn't make me go through that gate. Your father could never persuade me to go burrowing with him. He was only after old pennies, Gordon. What you go searching for and what you find aren't always the same.
I don't want this to come across as me being negative, but I just think there's lots of great. You feel like why is someone here wasted all their best ideas in this when they could have done so much other things with it? Because we have this mystery of Ewan, that we know the child is dead. And as the story goes on, we are, through conversations between other characters and flashbacks, we are revealed elements of who this child was, what he was like, and what happened to him. How do you feel that mystery was played out in the book?
I thought it was one of the most interesting things in the book because it surprised me. The idea that it deals with a very uncomfortable, I don't have kids, but I know that it's a very uncomfortable topic for people, like it right back to sort of postnatal depression and things that, like, what if you don't have that bond with your kid, or what if you, and there's that famous tweet, what if the kid is just unpleasant to be around and has bad vibes or whatever. Like the idea that, like, you might not like your own child, or that your own child might actually be, dangerous or violent is a really hard thing for parents to deal with. So yeah, you from the start of the book, you're queued up to think of Ewan as a kind of an innocent who has sadly died, and then you're challenged to think, like his parents clearly do at certain points, maybe it was for the best, or maybe it was a lucky escape, or certainly he was not an uncomplicated child.
I like it when a mystery is discovered by the characters in the story, and I don't know if I felt like it was a cheat to just give us flashbacks out of order, so that it was almost like, how do I explain this? Like if part of the narrative was people finding out things out of order and then them having to piece together the story that way, it felt like to me that's a legitimate way of doing it. Whereas just by the writer deciding what, giving you different parts for no other reason apart from this is going to obscure certain elements of the story until we get to the end when I want to tell you those. I don't know. I don't know how I felt about that. I don't know if I felt manipulated by it.
It certainly felt like another complication and a problem I sometimes have with books. The more literary they get, the more the writers often seem to give into the temptation to go non-chronological. And I will, again, conversations with editors, quite often a good editor will just say to you, does this need to be quite so clever, or could we just do it chronologically? And it's often a good challenge, like, oh yeah, it's cleverness, it's structural cleverness making up for a problem with the story, I think.
It's like a Stephen Moffat script. It feels like he writes it and then he cuts it up, throws it in the air, and then puts it down again. And now we're going to watch it in this order and see how it goes. But I think, what you were saying about the them coming to terms with their child, I think there's a really good section which I'm probably going to get Beck to read out now, when they're talking about Juliette being so set of who her child was going to be, what that child was going to be like, and almost like the perfect relationship and the perfect child, and how she's going to be as a mother, that it was almost like she was setting herself up for a fall. And then I think then she feels guilty after the fact that maybe that it was her fault that it didn't turn out how she wanted, because she told everyone and put so much into that.
It seemed to Richard sometimes that Juliette had actually brought twins into the world, Ewan and guilt. The latter had always been the stronger of the two. It fed more, weighed more, demanded more of their attention. When it had outlived Ewan, it had grown larger still. Even before she fell pregnant, Juliette had talked about her boy, her Ewan, describing in detail the personality he would have and the clothes he'd wear. And while Richard always thought it nothing more than a rather sweet exercise of the imagination, it shocked other people that Juliette could have so much confidence in an untested womb. They dressed their concerns as jokes, but still, the feeling among friends and family had been that Juliette was in danger of jinxing herself and the child in some way, if a child came at all. When she was pregnant, it was easy to dismiss it all as superstition. But then Ewan had been born early, and when they tried for a second baby a year later, nothing happened. Then the thought that she had been presumptuous and had inflicted some damage on herself was hard to shake off. When Ewan passed away, she was convinced that it had been her who'd invited death to the house. But whether it had been a punishment or simply harsh biological fate, it didn't much matter in the end. No conclusion seemed to make sense. No one could explain what Ewan's life was supposed to have meant. He'd gone before he could really become anything or achieve anything. or make anything. It seemed that he'd only come into the world to take all their love and then fill them with sorrow.
I think there's a lot of guilt in this book, where a lot of the characters are feeling guilty. And because I've got 2 children, I think some of the things which my children struggle with are things which they've got from me. So one of my kids is dyslexic, and that's come from me. And I find that incredibly difficult to know that there's a given them genetically. It's not even like I brought them up a certain way, which I could have done differently. That I've given them something which is me, and I can't do anything about that. So I can see that. But it's also weird that I can remember imagining what my child was going to be like, and all I could imagine was that I was going to have a daughter, and I was in my mind saying, stop thinking that, because you don't want to. If it's a son, you don't want to be disappointed. But I ended up having 2 daughters. But it's one of those things that you can't stop your brain from telling those stories. And I think we're storytelling creatures, aren't we? And we can't help. But that, every time I buy a lottery ticket, I start telling the stories of what I'm going to do with the money. You think, don't do that, because all you're doing is jinxing it and spoiling it.
And I imagine there's almost like a biological or evolutionary imperative to imagine that you're going to have a perfect, wonderful child. Otherwise,
why would you do it?
Why would you do it? Yeah, you have to sort of believe that. And I was just thinking here as well that there's 2, maybe 3 ways of interpreting this. One is Ewan actually is kind of a bit psychopathic, a slightly maladjusted child who is going to grow up to be violent. At one point, Richard says something that he'll just be remembered as a violent little boy, like quite scary. And you think lots of little boys are violent. Like Paul McCartney did that interview years ago where he talked about killing frogs for fun. So you could say that he is actually that. Juliette is right, and Richard is in denial. Or you could say Richard is right. It's just boys will be boys. All a bit unfortunate. Upheaval. They move to a new village. He's acting out. He'll grow out of it. And maybe Richard was exactly the same when he was a kid. In which case, Juliette has mental health problems essentially, or is struggling with motherhood, which does make you think: did she let him die, or assist him in dying? Yes. And then there's a version where they're both kind of a bit right, but I don't know. I was going to ask you: do you think Richard is a sympathetic? Are we meant to be sort of in Richard's shoes? Because there are times when he drove me up the wall.
I felt like he did nothing to. He had no agency at all. Things were just happening to him. So there's we'll skip ahead a little bit to like the middle of the book. I feel like all the supernatural stuff, all of the mysterious stuff, all these spiritualist stuff, even the stuff with the beacons when they come, but we'll talk about in a moment, that could just be explained away as just these people are going through some shit and this is affecting them. But then Richard digs up the bones of a hare in the field, and in front of his eyes, I feel like, for me, probably one of the best written parts of the book, almost comes back to a bit like Hellraiser. The body just starts growing sinew and almost like from the inside out reconstituting itself and growing. And the character Richard just watches this happen. And it's almost like he has no response to it at all. And then he just picks it up, puts it outside, and lets it free. At that point, spring starts to spring starts to spring. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to say.
Yeah, that's what it does.
Juliette seems to start to come to terms with the death of the child and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like he did nothing to help his wife at the beginning. This all happens in front of him. He does nothing when it happens apart from pick the animal out and put it outside. He doesn't talk to anyone about it. There's no inner monologue of him thinking about that, like, well, that was weird. And it's just, that made me feel like, what the hell was this character for? Yeah,
it frustrated me the same way Scully used to frustrate me on The X-Files, which is right up until that point, his skepticism and him just repeatedly saying to Juliette, like, we need to get you some help. You're not right. What's going on? This is all nonsense. That sort of gruff, sensible bloke stuff he does. Totally justifiable. When he's watched a hare reconstitute itself from its bones in front of him and he's literally observed this happening, at that point, you might expect him to pop into Juliette and go, sorry, I was wrong. I totally believe in the supernatural now. The way I thought the world works, it absolutely doesn't. I was wrong. So if we've got a ghost, actually, that wouldn't surprise me after what I've just... that doesn't happen. And I think at one point he even acknowledges that, like, what he'd seen with the hair, that was different to all this nonsense that Juliette was going through. Like, he just isn't... He's not capable of empathising or changing his worldview. He's just kind of so set in his...
He doesn't even, like, say, well, I think I might be going mad.
Yeah.
Is that something... I haven't seen... Does that happen in the film?
It does happen in the film, yeah. And it's quite well done, I seem to remember. They changed the plot quite a bit for the film, I think, which was quite controversial in some ways. But I think the central image of the hair resurrecting is in there, yeah.
By the evening, the fur of Peach Fuzz had thickened to a rich pelt the colour of dry earth. Whiskers pronged from the snout. Genitals swelled like little tubers. The ears unfurled from buds of gristle into tall, ragged lugs. Seeking an explanation for it all seemed ungrateful. A great kindness was at work here, and he felt that by questioning the restoration, he might jeopardise its fulfilment. He didn't feel confused. He had witnessed what had happened, and there it was. He wasn't being asked to wonder, only observe and be awake to what he was being shown. The spring was coming. Soon, there would only be newness. At dawn the next morning, 4 days now since Mrs. Ford and the Beacons had been, a thrush was whistling just outside the window, and its sudden scatter of notes seemed to accelerate the changes in the hair. It troubled Richard that he was finally witness to a process of reconstruction that, until now, had been so confidential. But yet he couldn't look away. As he sat down to watch, something bubbled up inside one of the eye sockets, and, using the magnifying glass again, he saw tiny white beads growing like mould on the optic nerve. They engorged and merged, and as a pearl forms around a speck of grit, an eye grew milky white. For a time the hair looked blind, but after a while there came a gradual bleeding of colour, and the blank sclera first turned yellow, then orange, before deepening to a dark shade of honey wax. Then, as if a spot of ink had been dropped onto the cornea, the black of the pupil widened and widened until the hair was staring at him. Richard sat for some time before laying his hand on the animal's flank. It was still cold under the fur. There was no beat of life inside its chest. If he were to lift it up, the hair would hang limply. But touching the pelt seemed suddenly like defilement, and he took his hand away, hoping that he hadn't brought the hair's revival to a premature end. It seemed prudent to leave it alone for a while longer yet, and he gently tucked the blanket around the animal before setting the box down by the radiator again. With some reluctance, he closed the door and went out into the field. For the rest of the day, as he hunkered inside the tent and worked the trowel into the soil, there was an overwhelming sense of imminence, of things brimming on the cusp. And when the candle in the kitchen finally went out, everything overflowed.
AI is transforming customer service. It's real and it works. And with Finn, we've built the #1 AI agent for customer service. We're seeing lots of cases where it's solving up to 90% of real queries for real businesses. This includes the real-world, complex stuff like issuing a refund or cancelling an order. And we also see it when Finn goes up against competitors. It's top of all the performance benchmarks, top of the G2 leaderboard, and if you're not happy, we'll refund you up to $1 million, which I think says it all. Check it out for yourself at fin.ai.
Just want to talk about the bit with the beacon scum when these occultists arrive at the house. I felt like a seance, particularly in this kind of way, is like a cliche alert for me. This is in the main podcast we watch British horror movies, and I can list off here ones which had very similar scenes. So we got Night of the Demon, Quatermass in the Pit, Hands of the Ripper, Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. They all seem to have a seance in there where you kind of feel like that the medium might be a charlatan, then something supernatural kind of happens, and it kind of shocks the medium to thinking that, or actually there might be something in this after all. And it felt to me like, I think it was incredibly well written and well done. This is something which I've seen or heard many times before.
Yeah, he didn't do anything unusual with it, did he? So the general vibe of the book is when he employs a cliche, he does something a bit interesting with it. And I think cleverly he set us up to expect the Beacons to be sinister in some way, that they were up to something. And I think it becomes clear that they weren't. They're pretty sincere people who believed what they were doing and believed it would be helpful. But But I suppose I thought that when the seance happened, the seance would take an unusual form, or it would lead to a surprising result, and it leads to exactly the result you would expect it to have. The presence they're trying to communicate with turns up. I mean, I've read online lots of theories about, but because the hair is around, the light of Ewan's light gets into the hair and all of this sort of stuff, but that's not explicit in the book, I don't think.
Well, that's one of the things I was going... So we talk about the hair gets reconstituted, the hair gets let out, and you're meant to feel like, oh, everything's gone, everything's good now, spring is coming, the spirit of the child has gone into nature, the parents have finally come to terms with the death of the child. But that's the end of part one, so it can't be the case. But then the hair comes back. Like you said, it's not implicit who the hair is. So is it the spirit of Ewan, or is it, so this is something we haven't talked about yet, or is it this entity, Jack Grey, which is kind of like some kind of like spirit of the woods, or a green man, or something which the child, Ewan, has been saying, has been talking to him, and it makes him scared to go into the field. But later on, when we start learning some of the violent acts Ewan's done, he says Jack Grey told him to do it. So are we led to believe that the hair is Jack Grey, or is he Ewan? What do you think?
I think it's Jack Grey, and I think Juliette has been tricked into thinking it's Ewan, or that there's some element of Ewan in it. And I was wondering as well, if you'd set this story if you told a story like this and it was set in the 17th century, a grieving mother who's lost her young child, a hair appears from the woods and she suckles it at her breast. You'd be like, Witch's Familiar. This is like absolutely that kind of vibe, which I guess is the folk horror, another of the folk horror aspects of this story. And that but because it's the 1970s, that feels less. I mean, it wasn't acceptable in the 17th century, very much not, but you know what I mean? It feels much odder in the 1970s, I think.
But I really like the idea that they think it's Ewan, but it is actually this other entity. But I'm just not sure. I suppose maybe I just needed to think about it harder in order to get that. But it's one of those things I felt like if that was more implicit, I might have enjoyed that a bit more.
I don't think he wants us to be able to be sure. And you could get into a whole loop, which is like, well, has Jack Grey already possessed Ewan? Is that why Ewan is being violent? Or is it that, you know, there is no Jack Grey and it's Ewan's spirit has gone into the hair and like, so you're left, I think, with all of those possibilities and that sense of uncertainty is sort of, I think, probably deliberate, I think.
So do you think if they took out the whole reconstitution of the hair in the middle, that this whole story could have just been seen as, there'd be way more ambiguity of that if anything supernatural is happening at all?
Yeah, I think so. There's nothing that we see or that Richard sees that couldn't be explained another way, other than the reconstitution of the hair, I think. Everything at the seance is just Juliette saying, I saw something, and everyone else saying they saw something, but Richard never sees it. And we don't have it described to us. It's just something that everyone is reacting to.
And I really like that. That's a good point, actually. And I think that's a nice thing that could be explored in other stories as well. If you're the only person who's not witnessing something, does that mean that, you know, so if you're in a room with three people, two people see something, one person doesn't, you've got to say that it happened, haven't you? But if there's one, and I just trying to come to terms with, but I've been in sort of like religious situations before when people are saying, you know, they're having some kind of religious experience, and it's difficult to be the only one who's saying, I'm not feeling this. This is not. I'm not. Yeah, and you can see how people can get brought along into this kind of thing just because they want to feel like they're part of something special.
I was going to mention as well that just on the first half of the book, the obvious things that struck me as influences on this book, and I'd love to know whether he's ever acknowledged this, but like Don't Look Now feels like the big reference point, which is, you know, grief-struck couple sort of drifting around Venice, haunted by the presence of their dead child. And there's also a slightly more obscure film from around the same time called Voices. Have you ever seen that one with David Hemmings?
No, I don't think so.
I want to say, I can't remember the actresses in it, but they play a couple whose son has died in the pond at their country house. and they're bickering and fighting. It's really weird because it's shot on video, even though it's a feature film. And I'm not going to spoil that one, but it's a very, very similar sort of vibe to Don't Look Now, but with a different twist, is what I'll say. That seemed to be an influence on this one.
The twist, which my dad said, he recorded it for me when I was young. He said, "This is a really good film. This this happens at the end." And I was like, "Oh, thanks."
Yeah, my dad did that with Psycho. Yeah, and he was like, "You're going to really love this," and then just told me the ending. I was like, and I did really love it, and I still love it. But my partner, when she saw it for the first time, did not know the twist, and I got to sit there and watch her go, "No way!" at the end of Psycho, which was really nice.
Although when I was watching Lost with my wife after I'd already seen most of it, she said, "You're spoiling this because every time something's going to happen, you turn and look at me," and it's just like, you've got to stop doing that.
Yeah.
We find out the backstory of Ewan as we're going through, slightly out of order, but it starts off with him sleepwalking. He's hearing the voice of Jack Gray. Made me think a bit of Reagan in The Exorcist, so early with Captain Howdy and stuff at the beginning of that. There was quite a nasty part when he goes missing on New Year's Eve, and they find him blood in his hand, and you think that he's cut himself. But then you realise that he's crushed a mouse in his hand, and he said that Jack Gray's taught him how to catch animals. And I thought that's one of the really creepy scenes in there. I thought that was great. That not only is he done that, but it's almost like that supernatural element of him being able to capture animals, which he probably wouldn't be able to do.
And there's a little bit of The Omen in there as well. I wonder if when, again, knowing that this was written as a pastiche of a 1970s book that was supposed to have come out in 1972, I wonder if Andrew Michael Hurley sat down and wrote down 70s things, The Exorcist, Don't Look Now, The Omen, and he sort of, all of that was in the mix when he was thinking about what 70s stuff was, I wonder.
Yeah, so we reviewed The Omen back along, and that said that Richard Donner said, "I want this to be like, you could watch this and nothing actual supernatural happens in it," and it's kind of true, isn't it? Like it could just be a load of people, because you don't even know if that jackal they find is his mother. Spoiler. And I don't know why they changed that in the New Omen. They swapped it around and stuff, but yeah, I think that I really like that how The Omen does that, where like it could just be a load of conspiracy theorists just making out this, like you said, a normal young boy who's just a bit messed up is the devil. But then we build up to this the thing he did, which made the whole village turn against him, and it is quite horrible, of him stabbing a pony in the eye with a stick. You would move straight. Yeah, you would have to move if you did that. If your kid was the one who did that in that. But then we also find out that Juliette has confided in the friend of the family, Gordon, who's one of the beacons, that she caught Ewan about to try and kill his father by dropping pebbles into his mouth while he was sleeping. And that is a really chilling idea, because imagine waking up with stones in your throat and your child watching you choke to death. It was horrible. I thought that was a really creepy thing, but also potentially the reason why Ewan was got rid of. Yeah.
And again, we've only got Juliette's word for that as well.
Yes.
Like, and Richard just goes, "Oh, nonsense, absolutely, of course, rubbish." We don't know. We haven't got enough information to know whether Juliette's making it up or not. And if Juliette is essentially suffering from delusions, believes her son is evil and lets him die or kills him, or whether she's absolutely right and she's saved Richard's life, we don't have enough to say.
Juliette says that she was with Ewan when he died, and Richard was saying, "No, I found him when he was dead." So there is an implication here that potentially she could have killed her son. So what's your thoughts? Do you think she did?
And I think there's a suggestion, isn't there, that Richards kind of says, "Oh, you're just saying that because you feel guilty, and actually it was nothing to do with you. It could have happened at any time." I think it didn't feel impossible to me that she could see he was having an asthma attack and let him die, there's a film that I saw that exact plot point in, which was a J-horror film, and I'm trying to think which one it was, but there's a J-horror film that has a whole thing where the ghostly kid was harming her little sister while her mum was out of the house. And then eventually when she has a fatal asthma attack, her mum just lets her lie there on the floor and die. And that's why she's back as a vengeful ghost. So I've just remembered that I'd seen something similar. But yeah, that something like that seems plausible. And do you judge Juliette for doing that? I don't know. That's it.
So the hair returns, and then Juliette starts treating him like a baby. So you think the story end of part 1, you think everything has turned out for the good until the hair comes back, and she starts putting him in like a cot, or putting him to sleep and stuff. The character of Harry, Juliette's sister, who's there trying to help out, they sort of conspire to kill the hair, to poison the hair. And I thought, again, that's a nice little sort of mirror up to potentially Juliette of killing the child. They're trying to kill the rabbit, hare. I thought that was quite nice, but that sort of didn't go anywhere. That sort of because I feel like part 1 had so much more happening in it, and the setup, there was so many elements on there. But I feel like part 2, it was basically the hair coming back, and we have this story of the wood cuts as we go through, where we find out that there was a execution, a hanging on this tree of 3 men in, I don't know what period. Did you think 17th century, something like that? Yeah. So we find out that those 3 men, and this is another one of these examples where you have to sort of read between the lines of what actually happened. I feel like one of them set fire to some hay in order to distract people. Another one, I'm always worried about saying this sort of thing because it makes it, when I say, I think he was saying he was having sex with dead bodies in the crypt. Mm-hmm. But if I got that completely wrong, that reveals something about my mind rather than, and the third, I was throwing children off the top of the church. Did I get that right?
Yeah. I think that's right. Yeah. And that third one is the one that's really shocking, that you even sort of that remote of like, it's a woodcut from the 17th century or whatever. And you think, flipping heck, like that's quite strong stuff.
Yeah. And then the big reveal is the last part of that. And I think it's interesting that he finds the woodcuts in order of the narrative, which is nice and convenient. That the last one, you see the hair coming out of the woods at their execution, so it's implying that this is something which has gone around and come around again.
Yeah, and that all ties in. This underlying thing about the fact that his dad might have been through another cycle of this, and that perhaps Richard was lucky to have been sent off to boarding school and have escaped.
Yes, I didn't miss that. Yeah.
All of this, I think, is sort of a suggestion. And yeah, how many cycles have we been there? Is it every year? Is it every spring?
Yeah,
the hair reemerges. And
I like the idea of, and I think it comes out in one of the other books, the Devil's Day, about if you are part of a family which has a family homestead where you're inheriting that, you don't really have a chance to tell your own story. Mm-hmm. Because they're talking about earlier on in Starve Acre when he doesn't really want to bring his wife back to that house, but she sees it as like a new start because it's a new start for her as how she hasn't lived in before. But this is his family home and generations of his family, and like we said, and stuff's been happening in that field over all these years, and it's one of those things like all you're doing is painting over. You're repainting the walls, changing the furniture, but then you've got a story upon story upon story, and it's just, and either you're destined to sort of repeat the stories yourself, or you're just part of a loop.
It makes me wonder about the blood test that we were both a bit puzzled by earlier, whether that was maybe there's something in that bloodline of the Willoughbys, mm-hmm. and the blood test was meant to weed him out, and that's why faking it got him into the room, when actually if they'd known he was a Willoughby, they wouldn't have wanted him there. Is it almost like Edgar Allan Poe thing? I don't know. Something like that. I think
there's something to do with like an hereditary of like a bloodline of because potentially these people could have been relatives to him. I feel like there is something about the blood, of the story coming through the blood. And then we have the end of the story where this is the scene where Richard comes back and finds that Juliette is basically suckling the hare.
Outside, Richard heard Harry pulling into the driveway. The car juddered for a moment or two and then fell silent. Wished that he'd bolted the front door. That would have bought him some more time with Juliette. Leaving the prints on his desk, he went upstairs to warn her that her parents had arrived and found the door to the nursery unlocked. She was in her dressing gown, still damp from the bath. She invited him in and went back to watching the hare as it started to twitch itself awake under the blankets in the cot. A nightlight held the room in a soft blue glow. The clock ticked. Some more of Ewan's toys had been recovered from the boxes in the scullery, and the rug was littered with plastic animals and brightly coloured building blocks, some stacked, some knocked over in fun. Below, the hallway became loud with talk as Harry, Eileen and Doug came in. The phone began to ring again. Richard tried to speak to Juliette, but she hushed him and leaned over the bars to pick up the hare. It took some effort. It had grown large and muscular. Its long body dangled, and she folded in its wheeling back legs until it rested against her chest. She had been right. The hare wanted to be here. It had always wanted to be here. When he'd taken it out to the field, it had tried to get back to Starvacre and find Juliette. It had only run into the wood because he'd forced it that way. Eileen called out. Richard heard her heels going into the kitchen. Harry answered the phone and began arguing with Gordon. "What should I do?" said Richard. "Let them come," Juliette said. "But they can't see you like this." Eileen was running up the stairs now, yelling for Juliette again. Doug followed her, shouting louder, but there was no anger in their voices, only a strain of fear that Richard knew well. It was the unique dread of every mother and father. The persistent sense that their children had always been drifting away from them, out of reach and beyond their help, into their own deranged worlds. Sitting in the rocking chair, Juliette set it going with her foot and stroked the animal's ears. When it was settled, she undid the belt of her dressing gown, working her shoulder free and cupping her breast, which had grown engorged and milky white. She offered the nipple to the hare, and, with a paw resting on her sternum, it latched tight and drank.
What do we think of the ending? What's your thoughts?
I mean, I really liked it. And I think I said earlier on, if you look online, it's a 50-50 split, I think, between people that go, wow. It's like just when you have these sort of abrupt, enigmatic endings, when they work, what happens is they just leave you suspended with all of that discomfort for a moment, and they don't give you any resolution or any relief. So they sort of leave you like, and I think what 50% of people wanted was like, okay, but what happens next? Like, what is the solution? And I suppose it would be disappointing if we then got to see with her being taken off to a mental hospital or I don't know, like, you know, the end of The Witch, the 2015, is that one? Robert Eggers, yes. I saw someone today call him Bobby Omelettes, which I'd never seen before. And he finishes that with that unambiguous, like, oh, okay, definitely witchcraft. She's floating in the air. There's like, so we could have finished with something like that where, you know, where Juliette is suddenly holding the devil in her arms or something. But the fact that we're left with that, it could go either way. So going back to your point, what is there in this book that we know is definitely supernatural? A woman is doing something weird with a hare. Is it supernatural? Is it she just having a moment? We don't know.
But I think the book is just short enough to get away with it, because I think these type of endings for me are short story endings. Mm-hmm. Because often it's something which you can read this in one sitting. I think I did it in two. You haven't invested enough to be pissed off that you haven't found out what happened. If this was, you know, maybe twice the length and I had that ending, I think I would be like, what the fuck? Yeah, that was a waste of my time. Whereas I think that I feel like I think for me it worked. I think it was a good ending. I felt like this book was almost like a pitch for a film. And I'm not surprised it became a film, because there's a lot of visual bits in it. There's bits when she's having Juliet's having a haircut by her sister, and that felt so filmic to me that I can see that happening. And I feel like there was nothing in this book which could not be shown in a film. Maybe that's why we don't have something like the inner monologue of Richard thinking, oh, this is what he's thinking about this hair reconstituted, because in his mind he said, oh, okay, well, when I get this option for a film, they won't be able to film that, but it works because of the length of the story. I was more, not upset, but I think more disappointed with some of the other elements which didn't, which I felt could have gone somewhere which didn't, rather than having a problem with that ending.
And it's interesting to think about if this had been like a 500-page Stephen King type novel, or like, I don't know, James Herbert or someone, it would have, the difference is the last 100 pages would have been things escalating, like a storm blowing up and Richard stalking around with an axe and like, the hair's suddenly 12 foot tall or something. But because we don't have that escalation here, it's hard to know where you could go otherwise with the ending, really. Like, yeah. And also the original version that was published in 1972, the one that was the Eden Book Society, had a different ending, which, if I've got this right, the different ending has Juliette killing Richard, which they obviously, that conversation with an editor somewhere, like, yeah, that ending, it's better if you just leave it ambiguous. So this is like a choice, but in the first version he made a different choice, which was a bit bigger, I guess.
Interesting, because part of me wanted maybe a bigger ending, but as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh, no, just wind it back and leave it how it was. It's good.
Yeah. And the thing for horror writers as well is it's so hard for every story not to end up with someone being killed or going mad. Those are the two endings. So you try and do something different to that is the challenge.
Hello, General Witchfinders. It's Lottie here. Thank you so much for the recommendation of Starve Acre. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It reminded me of the claustrophobic exploration of the psychological deterioration in the yellow wallpaper, kind of mixed with the supernatural spookiness as well of The Small Hand by Susan Hill, which, if you haven't read it, it's a really short novella, but it's really spooky and fantastically written. One thing that really got me was the spin on the Green Man lore, which the author used to kind of portray Jack Gray as this spirit bound in the soil, and the way that spirit used the parents' grief as an energy force to manifest himself back into the physical world. I thought that was a really clever way of using the landscape to enhance the parents' feelings and bring that hair into reality again. I did think that the ending was very abrupt, and I wondered how much further Juliette would spiral with her mothering a hare up in the nursery. Would she continue to reject the external world? And would she ultimately have performed acts of violence under Jack's influence? Or would both Juliette and Richard succumb to the same madness as Richard's father? I would love your thoughts. Thank you.
So it sounds like Lottie guessed the original ending from the original version of the book.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah.
So have you read any of the other two books you mentioned?
I've read The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a long short story, I think we call that one, by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. It's one of the sort of all-time classics of supernatural fiction. So every time you get a great ghost stories anthology, it will be in there. And that's interesting that Lottie's reading based on that would be that Juliette, that's a story about someone going insane, and all of the supernatural in the story, I think, from what I recall, it's her looking at some pattern wallpaper and imagining things in the wallpaper as she has a mental breakdown. So that reading would be that Juliette, a lot of this is Juliette having a breakdown. Having said that, Lottie also says, and I thought this was a really smart observation actually, that it's their grief powers the rejuvenation of the hair, like it's a force. And I thought, that's interesting if you think of grief as like a power or an energy source rather than a drain. It's like a sort of psychic force. That's really interesting.
It's giving me goosebumps thinking about that. That's great. So what's that? There's a term, and I always say Telpa. Is that?
Yes.
So is that my understanding of that is the Slender Man, for example, is one of these things where it's something which is fictional, but if enough people talk about it or think about it or do things related to it, it becomes real. And that could be along these sort of lines. So if we've got all this negative energy in the house. Richard is learning about this Jack Gray creature, or he's concerned that people are talking about it too much, or his child is thinking about, or that his child kept talking about this thing. they could almost like conjure that thing up, even if it's just real to them. Like going back to you was talking about the witch earlier. I've got a witch tattoo after watching the Black Phillip because that film really stuck with me afterwards, of the whole idea, particularly of that reality is what you believe it is, and that whole thing of what that family thinking their child was going to hell because it had been baptized. It doesn't matter what you would say to those people to say that is not true. There's no way of you ever proving that, and it doesn't matter if you proved it, because if they believe it, they're still feeling the same guilt and the same trauma of that thing, because the reality is what they make of it. So I don't know where I'm going with that, but I feel like, you know, the whole thing in this book could just sort of come from that bad energy, that grief, and them be obsessing themselves around the whole idea of this entity.
Even if it's in Rich's case, in denial, that's still kind of an energy. And like, so if he's in denial and Juliette believes there's a tension, so maybe it doubles. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you could definitely come up with some kind of logic.
The issue I have is the
okay. Should we go to James
on it, describing it as a folk horror, where I felt the horror elements were definitely lacking from the novel. It sort of hints to stuff about being scared of your own child, and the horror I guess all parents have of like their offspring being evil or just not a nice person. But again, it feels like one of the many threads in the book that weren't followed and finished. So you had the main character dig in for the roots, and then he uncovers the hair comes to life, and then he seems to ignore that until it comes back. Let's talk about Jack Gray. The boys talk about Jack Gray. Again, we don't really get any more depth from that at all. And the mother's madness and guilt and what happens after the seance style thing, it all seems like be building up to something and building up, and then just comes to an abrupt end without any grisly resolution, which you'd hope from a folk horror sort of book. You want that climatic ending, and it sort of fizzles out with maybe a nod to Grapes of Wrath.
So, like Lottie, sceptical of the ending, or a bit disappointed in the ending, and I think that ties into that conversation we were having about, you know, in a more traditional horror novel, things would escalate, and they sort of emotionally they do, but they don't really. It doesn't all kick off quite satisfyingly, maybe, and yeah. I was just thinking there's something really interesting about this book and The Witch, which is folk horror created after the invention of the term folk horror, as opposed to folk horror, like all the stuff you review on the main podcast, which is none of those people knew they were making folk horror. They were making just a horror film, and it probably feels like folk horror because the only place they could afford to film it was a field in home counties or whatever. Whereas this is quite self-consciously kind of nodding to the tropes of folk horror.
Yeah, and I think as soon as you define something, it can then become almost like a cliche, and all you're doing then is trying to almost react against that definition. I felt like there wasn't an escalation of sorts. I think you had the Juliette going missing, them trying to track her down, them Harriet bringing the family. They're incoming, so you got the family coming to take her away from the house and take her back to Scotland. We have the killing of the dog, which we didn't mention, which is something which you can almost put that in your checklist of if you see a dog in a horror film, that dog is going to be killed at some point. But I think that there was an escalation, but then it was weird. Have a weird view, and it made me think of Baby, Nigel Neal's Beast, but whereas you just had something look really fucking weird happen at the end, and then it just stopped.
Now you mention it, it's exactly the same as that, isn't it? That must be where he got that image from. That must be where again, his I'm imagining his big list of 70s stuff. He must have had that on it. Yeah.
Is she breastfeeding the thing at the end? I can't remember.
I think she is. Yeah. I'm sure you'll edit this to make it sound like we knew for sure. No, I think she is. Yeah, I don't care if people know that. I've forgotten. I've forgotten so many things I've read and seen. I think she is. Yeah, I think she's certainly nursing it at the end of Baby. Yeah, that must be where that. And it's the same kind of just sudden ending, isn't it? Yeah, no, good shout on that.
Yeah, and I think you can almost, I can almost see the editing of like, you get that, and you just have it and just leave everyone, in silence in the cinema. I can see where James is coming from, and I do know James. I've read a lot of his stories, and they do get grisly towards the end. I can see it didn't sort of fit into his kind of aesthetic, if that's the right term.
And I suppose back to that thing I said earlier, like how would this end if Stephen King had written it or something? I was just thinking, I saw Backrooms the other day. I don't know if you've seen that yet. But an American version of this with a bigger climax might end with Jack Gray as a 12-foot tall, monster. There's no monster. There's no big bad at the end of this. Is there? Which is that sort of traditional way to wrap up a proper scary horror film.
And I do think, often when you had in those accounts of witchcraft from those time, the devil, would be something small, like a goat or a rabbit, or even like some of these familiars might be little mice and stuff. And it's just, there's something very kind of weird of having something which is meant to have all that power into something so small. And it just almost makes it, I don't know, a bit more frightening because it's just so weird. All right. So have you got anything else you would like to say about Star of Acre?
No, I think other than just to say that, I found it annoyingly well written and it made me want to read more of him. And I'm intrigued that you have, not in so many words, said this is kind of a minor entry compared to his other books. So I'm interested to read more of his writing.
Well, I hope you do. That's great. And he's got a new one coming out soon as well, apparently. Be interesting to see. And I'm going to go and watch the film now. It's been one of those ones where I really wanted to watch it, but I've been holding off. Well, thank you very much, Ray, for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to plug and anywhere you'd like to send people to find out more about you and your work?
I was thinking about what to plug because that's what you traditionally do at the end of a podcast appearance. And obviously, I'd love it if everyone went and read my latest collection of stories, Thin Places in Hard Concrete, available at that one bad bookshop that everyone hates. But and I'm sure an independent bookshop could get it if they wanted to. And I also particularly wanted to say that I've not dabbled in folk horror all that much. But there is a story in Intervals of Darkness called Night of the Fox, which is my sort of big attempt to do a classic folk horror story. So I'd be quite, if anyone's into folk horror, that would be an interesting one to go and have a look at, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I highly recommend Ray's short story books. I think I was giving Municipal Gothic to everyone one Christmas as my go-to Christmas present. So it was excellent. And I'm very, very proud that we have some of his stories in our zines. So go and seek those out as well. Next time, in September, we'll be returning with Benighted by J.B. Priestley.
A group of travellers find themselves marooned in the Welsh countryside by torrential rains and buffeting winds. Desperate to find shelter from the storm, they flee to a crumbling mansion where they're reluctantly taken in by the cloistered, erratic Femme family. Strange on first meeting, the secretive family's true peculiarities only become clear as the night unfolds.
Thank you, Ray. That's great. If you live close enough to Dorchester to attend the in-person book club, contact Teaser and Skylark at teaserandskylark@gmail.com to join up. If not, please find your local independent bookshop and order a copy and read along at home. We would love to hear what you think. If you send us your feedback to generalwitchfinders@gmail.com, and if it gets featured, we'll send you a book club badge. All the details are in the show notes, including how to sign up to our email newsletter. But until then, happy day.
Continue the conversation with us and fellow readers. Visit generalwitchfinders.com or find us on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Patreon. Support your local independent bookshop when you purchase the next title on our reading list. Remember, the story never truly ends.
Your phone is your lifeline. Calling your kid to say goodnight, waiting on a job callback, or just sending a meme to your best friend when it's been that kind of day. Wherever life takes you, the TextNow app keeps you connected for free. Get a real phone number, unlimited talk and text, and 5G data for your favorite apps, all for $0 a month. No fixed contracts, no hidden fees, no panic when bills pile up, just phone service that's there when it matters most. TextNow. We've got your back. Download TextNow in your app store today. Wireless plans require the purchase of a SIM card. Visit textnow.com for terms and conditions.
She offered the nipple to the hare, and, with a paw resting on her sternum, it latched tight and drank. Bleh!